The day I walked into my new job and saw my online boyfriend sitting behind the CEO's desk, I completely stopped breathing. Not because he was handsome, not because the office was massive, but because for 6 months, he had been telling me he was just a regular guy who worked in logistics. And I had believed every single word. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start in a fancy office building. It starts at 2 in the morning, in my tiny apartment, eating cold noodles and stress scrolling through my phone after the worst week of my entire professional life. My name is Mia, and up until 8 months ago, I was the most average person you could possibly imagine. Entry-level marketing coordinator, 1-bedroom apartment with a broken radiator, and absolutely zero love life to speak of. That was before I matched with someone called Daniel on an app. Before everything I thought I knew got completely flipped upside down. And long before I walked into the glass tower downtown, shook hands with my new boss, and locked eyes with the man I had been falling in love with for half a year. A man who looked at me like he had absolutely no idea who I was. Except his hand. His hand held mine a second too long. Okay, so I need to explain how this even started, because the whole thing sounds completely unbelievable, and I promise you, living through it felt exactly the same way. 8 months before the office incident, I had just gotten absolutely humiliated at work. My manager took credit for a campaign I had spent 3 months building from scratch. Presented it to the executive team, smiled, and accepted the applause. Did not say my name once. Not a single time. I went home, I ordered delivery, and I made the impulsive decision to download a dating app because I needed something in my life to feel like it was going right. I was not expecting anything serious. I matched with Daniel within about 40 minutes. His profile was genuinely the most boring profile I had ever seen in my entire life. No shirtless mirror photo. No picture of him holding a fish. Just one clear photo, a slight smile, and a bio that said 3 words. Quiet. Honest. Tired. I laughed so hard I almost choked on my noodles. I sent the first message. I said, tired of what exactly? He replied in under a minute. He said, everything. You? And I said, also everything. And somehow, that was it. That was how it started. We talked every single day after that. And I mean every single day, without fail, for 6 months straight. Morning messages before work. Long voice notes during lunch breaks. Late-night conversations that went until 1, 2, 3 in the morning without either of us noticing the time disappearing. He was funny in this very quiet, dry way that caught you completely off guard. He would say something completely normal, and then there would be this tiny twist at the end that made you burst out laughing. He remembered every detail I told him, even things I mentioned once months ago and forgot I had ever said. I told him about the manager who stole my campaign. He remembered the specific name of the campaign. Weeks later, he asked how I was feeling about it. I told him I was terrified of escalators after a childhood incident involving a shoelace. He never once made fun of me for it. He just said, stairs exist for a reason. I told him my coffee order was embarrassingly complicated. He said, complicated orders are the sign of a person who knows exactly what they want. Which is a good thing. I was falling for him, and I knew it, and I could not make myself stop. But here is the thing. Daniel was vague about everything practical. Like, everything. I knew he lived in the same city as me. I knew he worked long hours. I knew he traveled sometimes for work. I knew he found most people exhausting and most meetings pointless. When I asked what he actually did, he always said logistics. Moving things from one place to another. Making sure operations run smoothly. It sounded boring and believable, and I accepted it completely. I never pushed. He never elaborated. And I was too caught up in how good everything felt to notice that he was describing an entire professional life without telling me a single concrete detail about it. 5 months into talking to Daniel, I got laid off. The same manager who stole my campaign decided to reorganize the department. 3 people were cut. I was one of them. I sat in the parking lot of my office building for 45 minutes before I could drive home. The first person I told was Daniel. He didn't say I'm sorry or that's terrible or are you okay. He said, what do you actually want to do next? Not what you think you should do. What you want? I typed back, I want to do brand strategy at a company that actually has vision. Not just making content for content's sake. Something that means something. He said, then that is exactly what you're going to do. I said, do you know how hard that is to get into? He said, I know how hard you work. Those are not the same thing. I stared at that message for probably 3 minutes straight. 2 weeks later, I got a recruiter email about a senior brand strategist role at a company called Vance Holdings. I had heard of Vance Holdings. Everyone in the industry had heard of Vance Holdings. They were known for being selective, quiet about their internal culture, and the kind of company that only hired people who already knew exactly who they were professionally. I applied thinking absolutely nothing would come of it. I got a call back within 48 hours. The interview process was intense. 3 rounds over 2 weeks. Competency questions, portfolio review, a full strategic presentation to a panel of directors. I worked on that presentation for 9 days. I lost sleep over it. I rewrote the opening slide 6 times. I called Daniel the night before the final round. He stayed on the phone with me until midnight while I practiced out loud. He asked me questions like he was actually on the panel. He pushed back on my weaker points. He told me exactly which part of my argument needed to be sharper. I said, you're surprisingly good at this for someone in logistics. He paused for just a second and then said, logistics involves a lot of strategy. I said, sure, okay. He laughed quietly. He said, you're going to be incredible tomorrow. Go sleep. I got the job offer the following morning. I screamed, alone in my kitchen. At 8:15 on a Tuesday, I sent Daniel a voice note that was mostly incoherent celebration sounds. He replied with 4 words. I knew you would. I spent the next week dealing with paperwork, background checks, start date logistics. The whole time, buzzing with this new feeling of things actually going right. Daniel and I had been talking about meeting in person for months. It kept almost happening and then something would come up on his end. Work travel. A project running late. A schedule that kept shifting. I had started to wonder, quietly and privately, if he was actually who he said he was. Not because he had ever lied to me about anything I could point to. Just because something about the vagueness had started to accumulate in the back of my mind. But then my new job started and I pushed that thought aside. My first day at Vance Holdings. I got there 10 minutes early because I always get somewhere 10 minutes early when I'm nervous. The lobby was all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling glass and the kind of quiet that expensive buildings have. Like, even the air is disciplined. The HR director walked me through the building, introduced me to my team, showed me my office, ran through the onboarding schedule. Then she said, before you get settled, the CEO likes to briefly meet all senior new hires on their first day. It's just 5 minutes. Very informal. I said, of course, no problem. I fixed my jacket. I checked my reflection in the glass partition. I told myself to be calm and professional and not ramble, which is the thing I do when I'm nervous. We walked to the top floor. The assistant outside the office knocked and pushed the door open. I walked in. And I completely stopped moving. Because sitting behind the desk, in a perfectly fitted dark suit, looking exactly like his profile photo except somehow sharper, more formal, more real, was Daniel. Not a Daniel. My Daniel. The voice note Daniel. The 3 phone call Daniel. The I knew you would Daniel. He stood up when I walked in. He extended his hand. He said, nice to meet you. I'm Daniel Vance. And his expression was completely neutral. Completely, perfectly, professionally blank. Like we had never spoken a word to each other in our lives. I shook his hand. I said, nice to meet you too. My voice came out steady. I have absolutely no idea how. Because inside my head it was absolute chaos. Screaming, questions, the replay of 6 months of conversations running at high speed, every vague answer he had ever given me suddenly making complete sense. Logistics. Moving things from one place to another. Making sure operations run smoothly. He ran an entire company. He was the CEO. And he had looked me in the eye and introduced himself like we were strangers. I sat down across from him. He asked me 2 questions about my strategic vision for the role. I answered them. He nodded. He said the team was glad to have me. I smiled. I said thank you. I walked back out of that office, down the hallway, into the elevator. The doors closed. I stared at my own reflection in the metal doors. I pulled out my phone and opened our chat. I typed one message. I said, logistics. Really? The little indicator showed he had read it immediately. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Then he replied. He said, we should probably talk. He knocked on my office door at exactly 6:30 that evening. The building had emptied out. The open floor outside was dark except for the city lights bleeding through the glass. He was still in his full suit, but his tie was loosened slightly, which I had somehow never imagined Daniel doing. He closed the door behind him. He said, I owe you an explanation. I said, you owe me about 47 explanations, actually, but sure, start with one. He sat down. He looked at me for a long second before he spoke, like he was deciding something. He said, I never lied to you about who I am. I never told you anything false. I said, you told me you worked in logistics. He said, I do work in logistics, among many other things. I said, that's not the same as telling the truth and you know it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you're right. It isn't. He explained that he had been on the app originally because someone on his executive team had bet him he couldn't connect with anyone genuinely while keeping his professional identity out of it. He had deleted the app after a week because he thought it was a pointless experiment. Then he matched with me. He said, I meant to tell you after the first week. Then after the first month. Then I kept finding reasons why the timing wasn't right. I said, the timing wasn't right for 6 months. He said, I know how that sounds. I said, it sounds like you were testing something. He said, no. It sounds like I was scared. I had not been expecting him to say that. He was not the kind of person who said scared. Nothing about the Daniel I had spoken to for 6 months, and definitely nothing about the man sitting across from me in this glass office, suggested that scared was a word in his regular vocabulary. He said, the longer we talked, the more I needed it to be real. Not the job, not the company, not any of the things that people find out and immediately start factoring in. Just me talking to you at 2 a.m. about things that actually mattered. I kept putting off telling you because I was afraid that the moment you knew, it would change what we were. I looked at him for a long time. I said, so you let me walk into this building today without any warning. He said, I was going to tell you last week. You got the offer and I was going to call you and explain everything before your first day. And then I thought, if I tell her now she might turn down the job because of me and she deserves this role. She earned it completely independently. I didn't want to be the reason she didn't take it. I said, so you said nothing. He said, I made the wrong call. I know that. I said, yes, you did. He looked at me steadily. He said, I'm not asking you to forgive it immediately. I'm asking you to let me explain it properly. And then decide. I looked out at the city lights for a moment. I said, you have 45 minutes. After that I'm going home. He stayed for 2 hours. Working in the same building as someone you are furiously complicated about is an experience I do not recommend to anyone. Because here's the thing. I was angry. I had every right to be angry. He had withheld something massive about himself for 6 months and then let me walk into a professional situation blindly, and that was genuinely not okay. But, and this is the part that made everything so impossibly difficult. He was still him. Every single instinct he had shown me over 6 months was visible in how he ran that company. He remembered things. He paid attention to what actually mattered. He pushed back when something wasn't good enough, and he was direct about it in a way that was never cruel, just honest. He had his assistant send me a coffee from the exact place that made my complicated order on my 3rd day. No note. Just the coffee in a bag on my desk when I arrived. I sent him a message that just said, this is manipulation. He replied, it's a coffee. The manipulation would be if I also remembered you hate when the cup has a sleeve because it makes it hard to hold. Which I also know. But I only did the coffee. I typed back, you're infuriating. He replied, I know. I'm working on it. The professional situation was genuinely clean. He was scrupulously, almost rigidly appropriate at work. No special treatment. No awkwardness. He addressed me the same way he addressed every other senior team member. I had more than one colleague tell me the CEO seemed to have a lot of respect for my strategic instincts, which was based entirely on the quality of my work. That actually meant a lot to me. More than I expected it to. But outside the building, in the texts that still came every evening, things were slower. More careful. There was a new weight to everything, which I think was both of us being more honest about what we were actually doing. One night, about 3 weeks after my first day, he sent me a voice note. He said, "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly and not the way you think you should answer it. Do you actually trust me? Not do you want to trust me? Not do you think you probably could if things were different? Do you actually?" I listened to it 3 times. I sent one back. I said, "I trust the person I talked to for 6 months. I'm still figuring out if that person and the CEO are actually the same person." He replied immediately. He said, "They are. I promise you they are. But I understand that you can't just take my word for that." I said, "No, I can't." He said, "Then let me show you." 6 weeks into the job, something happened that had nothing to do with our situation and everything to do with who he actually was. I found out that a director in my adjacent department had been quietly discrediting my work in cross-functional meetings. Not overtly. Not in a way you could easily call out. The subtle kind where someone adds a qualifier to everything you say and frames your contributions as promising but incomplete. I had noticed it. I had not said anything because I was new and I was still reading the dynamics and I did not want to come in hot. But apparently Daniel had noticed it too. He called a cross-functional alignment meeting. He opened it by pulling up a campaign framework I had built and walking through it piece by piece. He said, "This is the strategic direction we're moving toward. This framework was developed by Mia and it's the clearest articulation of where this brand needs to go that I've seen in 2 years. I want everyone in this room to understand what we're building toward and who built it." He didn't look at me once while he said it. He didn't make it about me. He made it about the work. After the meeting, I sat at my desk for a full minute just looking at the wall. Then I picked up my phone and sent him a message. I said, "You didn't have to do that." He replied, "Yes, I did." I said, "I could have handled it myself." He said, "I know. That's not why I did it. I did it because the work deserved the recognition and the room needed to understand where credit lies. That's just accurate information." I said, "You're doing the thing again." He said, "What thing?" I said, "The thing where you make something that clearly costs you something look completely effortless and low stakes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll work on that too." That evening he asked if I wanted to get dinner. Not through the app. Not through a text with 3 words. He called me, on the phone, and asked. I said, "This feels significant." He said, "It is significant." I said, "Okay. Yes, dinner." We went to a small place 2 streets from the office that he said he went to when he needed to not be seen. He was completely different in that room. Less formal, less contained, but not in a way that felt like performance. Just like the walls had come down slightly. We talked for 3 hours. At one point he said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "Before you found out, when you thought I was just someone normal who worked in logistics, were you happy?" I looked at him. I said, "Yes, I really was." He said, "I was too. More than I had been in years." And I kept thinking, if I tell her, some part of this changes. I didn't want to lose the version of this where it was just 2 people talking. I said, "I understand that. I also need you to understand that hiding it wasn't protecting us. It was protecting your fear." He held my gaze for a long second. He said, "You're right. And I'm sorry." There it was again. That word. Quiet and undefended and real. 3 months after my first day. We were not officially together. We had not made anything formal. There was an unspoken understanding that we were moving towards something, slowly, carefully, with both of us checking the ground before every step. I had come to understand something about Daniel that took me a long time to articulate properly. He was not cold. He had been described to me by several people in the company as the cold CEO, the one who was impossible to read, The one who said very little and expected a great deal and never explained himself. But that was not who he was. That was who he had learned to be because in his professional world, being readable had cost him things. The person who texted me at 2 in the morning was not cold. He was one of the most genuinely attentive people I had ever met in my entire life. He just kept that person locked away in a room that very few people ever got into. I had gotten into that room by accident, talking to him when he thought there were no stakes. And now that we were in the real world, with all the actual stakes present, he was slowly, deliberately letting me see that those two versions of him were not different people. They were the same person. One just wore armor. One night we were working late. Different floors, separate offices. He sent me a message at 11 p.m. that said, "The city looks good from up here. I thought you might want to see it." I went up to his floor. His office lights were low. He was standing at the window. I stood next to him. We didn't say anything for a while. The city spread out below us, all lit up and quietly busy. He said, "I thought about what you said. About the fear." I said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it. You were right. I was protecting my own fear and calling it protection for you. That wasn't fair and I need you to know I know that." I said, "I know you know that." He said, "I want to do this properly. Whatever this is. I want to not be vague about it. I want you to know exactly what I'm saying." I looked at him. He said, "I fell for you before I knew anything about your work or your background or whether you could do this job. I fell for you when you were eating cold noodles at midnight and messaging a stranger because you needed something to go right. And every single day since then, everything I have found out about you has made that worse. In the best possible way." I said, "Logistics." He turned to look at me. I said, "You called it logistics. Moving things from one place to another. Making sure operations run smoothly." He waited. I said, "I think that might have been the most accidentally accurate thing you ever said." He laughed. An actual real laugh. The kind I had heard 100 times through a phone speaker and never in a room. I said, "Ask me properly." He said, "Mia, will you let this be real?" I said, "It already is real. It's been real for 8 months." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You are so much braver than I am." I said, "Yes, but you're catching up. Here is what I know now that I did not know 8 months ago, sitting in my apartment eating cold noodles, swiping through a phone with zero expectations. The version of someone that shows up at 2 in the morning when there is nothing to gain and no image to protect, that is the real one. Everything else is the suit they've learned to wear." Daniel wore his suit exceptionally well. He had an entire building full of people who described him as untouchable. But he had also stayed on the phone with me until midnight before a job interview that, as it turned out, he could have simply handed me. He didn't. He helped me earn it. That was the whole story, really. In one detail. My cold CEO was never actually cold. He was just waiting for someone who would stay on the line long enough to find out. And I, apparently, was the kind of person who talked to strangers at 2 in the morning until everything made sense. Which means, in the end, we were exactly the right kind of disaster for each other. If you made it this far, you already know what you think about this story. Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever met someone who was nothing like you expected and exactly like you needed, you know exactly how this feels. See you in the next one.